Presentation of self in everyday life. Erving Goffman's presentation of self in everyday life. So, as we said, presentation of self in everyday life is Goffman's particular take, right, or his particular approach to symbolic interactionism. And we call that approach the dramaturgical perspective or dramaturgical analysis. You'll notice in your textbook that Henslin uses the word dramaturgy, right? Now, that is a very complex sounding word, but in reality, very simple idea. If you look at the word dramaturgy, dramaturgical, it has that in it, drama, right? So what Goffman is saying is that social interaction can be looked at as if it were a theatrical performance. So he's using the metaphor of the theater, right, or the analogy of the theater. So we act for each other. We present a self, and as we are presenting a self, we are basically acting. We're acting out roles. So I'm acting for you, and you're acting for me, right? So social interaction is like a theatrical performance where we play roles for each other. And we're going to have to get a little bit later on, we're going to have to talk a little more about that word role, okay? And when we interact with each other, we seek to present a coherent and a competent self in a manner that's not very different from how actors create characters, right? And how actors act out characters in a play. So we play roles, and we play these roles according to how we define the situation. So we've already talked about definition. Sorry for the glitch. So we play roles according to how we define the situation. We've already talked about what that means, what definition of the situation is, and how we use all different kinds of information, right, to define the situation. So he goes on to say that social interaction is like an information game. This is one of the phrases that he uses, right? Social interaction is an information game. As we play roles, we are engaged in a process of impression management. I'm trying to control the impressions that I give off to you, and at the same time, you're trying to figure out your impression of me, right? And you're doing the same thing. I'm trying to control the impressions I give off. You're trying to control the impressions you give off, and we each of us, right, are trying to project the identity that we want the other to confer on us. Okay, everybody okay so far? So maybe if you think about it, you get the idea, right? You get the understanding that he's really talking about acting. I'm acting. Right? I'm acting in such a way that I'm trying to get you to perceive me, for example, as competent, and I'm trying to present this coherent, competent self. And you're doing the same thing, right? And we're doing that to each other. All right. So social interaction is an act of communication, right? It's another very important thing. If you're a communication major, Erving Goffman is a very important guy for you to read. Social interaction is an act of communication. And remember, he's a symbolic interactionist, so he's talking about face-to-face communication. And he tells us, right, that face-to-face communication takes place simultaneously on these two different levels, the verbal and the nonverbal levels. And in that interaction, anything that carries information, right, to the other, he calls a sign vehicle. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit more about what sign vehicles are in a little bit, right? But basically right now, what a sign vehicle is anything that carries any sort of information. Could be words, could be gestures, okay? The meaning, he says, of the verbal is controlled by the nonverbal, controlled by the nonverbal context in which it's contained. Remember when we were doing culture and we were talking about nonverbal communication, and I brought up Erving Goffman, and we gave the little example about how the true meaning of verbal communication is determined by or controlled by the nonverbal context in which that message is contained. So again, you're walking down the hall one day and you see somebody and you say, hello, how are you? And they say, oh, I'm just fine, right? That means one thing. But if you said to them, hello, how are you? And they said, oh, just fine, right? That's a completely different thing. You've taken that one message, oh, just fine, and you've turned it completely into its opposite, right? And the first time you hear it, it's a person who's everything's okay. Maybe even they're happy. They're smiling at you and all that, and they're happy. Same words. Now, all you're doing is changing facial expression, changing tone of voice, changing posture, all that stuff, and the meaning of that message gets completely flipped. Now the person is obviously angry, or that person is being sarcastic. And so this is what he means when he says that the meaning of the verbal is controlled by the nonverbal context in which it is contained. Now, the other part of that is that nonverbal communication always serves as a check, right? Nonverbal communication always serves as a check on the true meaning of the verbal. Why is that? Well, basically, he says, and then get back into this notion of how this is acting, right? Nonverbal communication is much more difficult to control. Nonverbal communication is much more difficult to control. Any of you who have ever had to stand in front of your parents, right, at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning and explain why you're getting in so late, know that your nonverbal communication is much harder to control than the words that are coming out of your mouth. Okay, so this is what we do as we interact with each other. I am paying attention to the message you're delivering, what words are you using, and then what is the nonverbal context in which that message is presented. Are you being sincere, right? Are you being sincere? Do you mean what you say, right? Does that make sense? Okay, so I'm always using, as we're interacting with each other, we're always using the nonverbal as a check on the true meaning of the verbal. Okay, so this notion of impression management, you gotta keep that in mind. Impression management becomes an act. It becomes a performance, always of trying to keep the verbal and the nonverbal consistent. And that's not always easy to do, right? So we're always trying to keep our verbal communication consistent with our nonverbal communication. All right, so we have some other terms we need to look at that are all related to Goffman's presentation of self in everyday life. I think the first one I want to get to before I do any of the other ones is I mentioned before sign vehicles, and I hadn't defined it yet. So, I did say that sign vehicles were anything that carries information, right, in an interaction. And we have to think of these sign vehicles as part of the playing of the role, right, or part of the management of impressions that I give to others, let's say. So sign vehicles, well, say, well, anything that carries information in an interaction. If I'm looking at Henslin, I got old Jimmy Henslin here. If I'm looking at his book, the way he defines sign vehicles is he said that sign vehicles is the term used by Goffman to refer to how people use social setting, appearance, and manner to communicate information about the self. So sign vehicles are anything, right, that communicates information about the self. One way to look at it, right? But then he also uses the word setting. It's the way that people use the setting, the way they use the social setting. So if we're using the metaphor of the theater, the idea of sign vehicles can also include the notion of scenery, right? If social interaction is a theatrical performance, then theatrical performances have scenery, right? And that the scenery also conveys something about the self. So, I'm sitting here hunkered down in my office doing this, and I'm looking up from my computer screen, and I see over on the wall opposite over here all my various diplomas, right? So, what are they doing up there? Well, they are, from Goffman's point of view, they are sign vehicles. They're there to communicate to people that come into my office, and especially to students and so on, the air of competence, that I'm a competent role performer. So there we go. So they're sign vehicles, okay? Now, let me put him away. I may have to come back to him in a little bit. I'm going to throw him on the floor here. All right, and then what else do we have? Well, we have the notion of role. We talked about role already. We said that people occupy a status, but they play a role, right? So that the roles are these bundles of norms that go along with social positions, how we are expected to interact and how we are expected to act as an occupier of various statuses. I also at that time I also defined a role as a kind of a script, and I think the reason I did that was because we were going to be talking about Goffman, and if he's using the dramaturgical perspective, then the notion of a role as a script becomes even more important. So roles are these scripts that we internalize about performance of our behavior in relationship to a position, and we internalize those scripts, through socialization. If we bring back George Herbert Mead's notion of the I and the me, and we have, the me is the internalization of the script, and then the I is the way that we interpret that role, right? The way that we interpret that script. We bring our own uniqueness to the performance. Just like you could have various actors, all performing Hamlet. They would memorize the script. They would learn the script. They could learn all the lines. But then the way that they actually play the role is subject to a certain extent to their own interpretation of the role. So you'd watch actors performing the role of Hamlet, and each one of them would do it differently, but you would still recognize the role as that of Hamlet. You would still recognize the script, okay? Just like you would go to your different courses. You go to your different classes, and you have all these different professors, and they're all acting out the role. They're performing the professor's script, right, that you recognize, but they're all doing it in slightly different ways. They're all bringing their own interpretation of what that means to their performance. So the idea of a role, right, taken directly from the theater. Role performance, very easy idea, right? What's a role performance? Well, it's how a role is performed. It's how a role is played out by an actor. Played out by an actor within the limits that the role provides, because that's what roles do. Roles are bundles of norms that tell us how we ought to behave. So how we perform that role within the limits that the role provides. We get theater, we have front stage and backstage, right? So let me get that up here too. Front stage and backstage. So the front stage is the space where the role is performed. Now, I have space there in quotation marks because that space can be literally space, a place, or it could be a social space where we are performing the role. So a classroom for me is the front stage of my performance as a professor, let's say. It's also front stage for your performance as a student, or at least it's one of them. The backstage is where we step out of these role performances. And we, in order to make our role performance credible, we have to keep our front stage and our backstage separate from each other, right? If I'm trying to present myself as a credible role performer, then if that might mean that I want to keep you away from the place where I'm stepping out of the role. Because if you see me acting in a way that's not consistent with the role, that might threaten my credibility. This is a good place to talk about a guy named William Foote White. William Foote White, don't worry about him. I won't probably ever ask you a question about him, but I just want to use one of his examples, okay? William Foote White was an American sociologist who mostly associated with urban sociology, and he did a study of a community, a neighborhood in Boston back in the 1940s. And in that work, he talks about a diner. He did this participant observation study of this neighborhood. And he talks about this diner. And in the diner are waitresses. So, you know, if you ever worked as a server, a waiter or a waitress, you may identify with this example. You know, White talks about how these waitresses, you know, they are performing a role, and the role they're performing is the happy servant, right? You know, and they you know, are serving these customers. Most of them are men, and the men are crude, and they're constantly making, you know, bad, tasteless jokes and coming on to them. And you know, what do the waitresses do? Well, they smile and they laugh and they go along with them. And the reason they do that is because their livelihood, right, depends on tips, essentially. So they kind of play along. Now, they go back into the kitchen, and the kitchen is the backstage. And when they step into the kitchen, and now they're away from the customers, that's where the waitresses all can sort of share their secrets, and they, you know, what do they talk about? They talk about the customers. They talk about how, you know, how idiotic they are, and so on. Okay, so, you know, if you ever worked as a waiter or a waitress, maybe you had a similar experience. Okay. You know, you come out of the backstage, or you come into the backstage where you're away from the customers, and now you're kind of speaking your mind, and you're sharing that. In fact, one of the ways that we can understand this backstage is the backstage is the place where role performers kind of have their secrets. They share their secrets. And we don't want our audience, right? We don't want the audience to have access to that backstage, because it might be a threat to the credibility of our role performance. I hope you follow that. And basically, the audience is whoever we are performing the role for. So hopefully, you know, you can see, even to where we've gotten so far, that, you know, all of these terms are terms that are really, really consistent with the idea that we're using the theater, right, as a metaphor. So we have the audience. Who is it we're performing the role for? Okay, now you are a student, and you perform that role for your professors, but you also perform it for your fellow students. And we'll come back to that a little bit later on. Okay, face-saving behavior. This is something that, you know, people do. Goffman defined face-saving behavior as the techniques that role performers use to try to salvage a performance that's going poorly. So, you know, they make a mistake, in their role performance. They may try to cover it up somehow, or try to ignore or hope that what they did is ignored by others, to try to salvage their role performance. Okay, so that's face-saving behavior. Now you also have this. This is something that audiences do. Studied non-observance. So studied non-observance is something audiences do for role performers. They ignore flaws. Right? They ignore flaws in role performances. Audiences want a good performance, basically. So if the role performer makes a mistake, they will very often just simply ignore it, and allow the role performer to maintain their sense of credibility. So let's move on here. Teamwork. We talked about audiences, and now we can talk about teamwork. I have the term up here of performance team. Okay, the performance team. So just like we have an audience, we also have a performance team. The performance team engages in teamwork. So one of the things that Goffman was trying to tell us in this is that it isn't just me that plays the role, that very often two or more people might collaborate with each other in the playing of a role, right? Or two or more people may collaborate in the management of impressions together, all right? So, you know, maybe an example of this would be how, you know, a married couple, for example, might play that role of happily married couple, even though when they're out of sight of everyone else, they are constantly at each other's throats. Okay, so they are acting as a performance team. They're supporting each other's performances, and they are performing jointly. They're helping each other play the role of happily married couple. They are a performance team. Okay, role conflict. Okay, this is a really important one. We're going to have two. We're going to have role conflict, and we're going to have something called role strain. Role conflict, role segregation, and role strain. All related. They're all related things. So role conflict, the definition I have up here is, well, these are conflicts that someone feels between roles because the expectations attached to one role are incompatible with the expectations of another role. You have a role set. We've talked about that already. You have this role set. Each one of those roles has different expectations for you. Each one of those roles operates according to different values, right? And therefore makes different demands on you. Okay, so think about it like this. Imagine a person who is a parent, right? And then imagine that that person is also an employee. So those are two roles in that person's role set, employee and parent. Those roles make different demands on that person. So let's say the person has a very important quarterly report that they have to get done, you know, now. It's due, and they need to get it done. And that's the demand that their work role is making on them. At the same time, their child is having a recital, and now this is the demand that the parent role is making on this person. So the person is now confronted with having to choose which role they're going to play. If they ignore their work, if they give in, right, to the parent role, and go to the recital and don't get the quarterly report done on time, they are going to be a bad employee, right? They're going to be a bad employee. On the other hand, if they ignore the recital and get the quarterly report done. Now they're in this situation where their credibility as a parent, right? They're going to be a bad parent, right? Is facing them. So role conflicts are these things that we feel, right, between roles, because the roles make different demands on us, and sometimes we have to play, or sometimes we're confronted with situations where we have to choose which role it is we're going to play. And choosing to play one role is going to diminish our credibility in playing the other role. You have an article in your reader that you've been assigned about student athletes, right? And that article is about role conflict, okay? Role conflict in student athletes. And that article talks about how college athletes at the Division I level, how they're often faced with this role conflict. They have to, choose, and they have to negotiate that the demands placed on them as an athlete versus the demands placed on them as a student, because those are very different demands, and how they manage that, right? And one of the things the article says is they typically, not always, but typically choose to make the student role secondary and to emphasize the role as athlete. Role segregation, comes out of role conflict. Since we have these roles that are making these different demands on us, we try to keep those roles separate from each other. We want to avoid role conflict, because role conflict is, again, a threat to the credibility of our role performances. So role segregation is our attempt to compartmentalize these roles, keep them separated from each other, okay? And then we have role strain. So role strain, if role conflict is a conflict that people feel within, if role conflict is conflict that people feel between roles, then role strain is conflict that people feel within a role. So you are a student, and you play that role, like I said before, right? You play that role for different audiences. You play the role of student for your professors, and you play the role of student for your fellow students, for your colleagues. Each one of those audiences, professors and your fellow students, have different expectations, right, for how you're going to play that role. So what do your professors expect? Your professors expect that when they ask a question in class that somebody's going to want to answer that question. Now, some students may be very reluctant, right? They might be very reluctant to raise their hand to answer a question. And I've had students tell me this, they told me, well, I knew the answer, but I didn't say anything because I didn't want everybody to, judge me. If you're constantly in class and you're constantly answering questions that the professor is asking, maybe people around you are going to start seeing you negatively, right? They're going to start thinking like, well, you're trying to make us all look bad, right? And that's simply because the expectations of your fellow students is different than the expectations of your professors. And so sometimes you have to choose, right? You got both audiences in the room at the same time, and now you have to choose which audience you're going to play the role for. All right, everybody okay with that one? I hope.